whisper secrets bold and bold to behold them for who they are and what could be. Love's a spellcaster, the telecaster.
It is July 20th. Welcome to Real Talk, friends. Ryan Jesperson here with you. We've got a great show in store. Samuel G. Brooks behind the controls today. Sarah Hoyles has the day off. We're looking to you right out of the gates to chime in on a question that will become relevant in an interview about half an hour into today's show. So whether you're listening now live or whether you may even jump ahead, if you're eager to get to a conversation on flat tax, why not swing by my Twitter profile first at Ryan Jesperson and cast your vote. Would you support Alberta returning to a flat tax system? Everybody paying 10% provincial income tax or whatever the number would be if it proved to stimulate the economy. We pushed it out about 13 minutes ago. We've got about 260 votes, 266 to be exact. So far, 58% of respondents say no. They would prefer, well, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but let's assume they would prefer the so-called progressive income tax introduced by the Notley NDP back in 2015. 58% saying no thank you. 30%, just under 31%. You can tell I'm trying to game the numbers because this is where I'm at. I'm on the flat tax system. I support that. 31%, I'll tell you why, and some people are going to be pissed off at me, but that's my opinion. And I promise to not get pissed off at you for your opinion. How about we all agree that we can talk about this and talk it out? 31% say yes, and then 11% early on say, well, it depends, and they elaborate below. I see my pal Max Fawcett. Max doesn't even like the conversation because we're going to be talking to an economist that authored the report for the Fraser Institute. And Max has no time for things coming out of the Fraser Institute. It's okay. Some of us aren't afraid to listen to people with different perspectives. And let me also cheekily point out that I think we're probably the only talk show in Canada today that's going to talk to voices from the Pembina Institute and the Fraser Institute back to back. That's right, back to back jacks on Real Talk, where you'll get real talk 5 days a week. It's presented, of course, this show and every one we do by the team at Bitcoin Well. I know you have questions about crypto. Everybody's got questions about crypto. Your question might be, what the hell even is this? Or why do people even care about this? Or why is this even a thing? All the way up to, hey, how is the Lightning Network going to impact security on the next level of the... And then you can tell I'm out of my depth. But the learning curve is manageable because I talked to the team, the real life humans at Bitcoin Well. They've helped me sort out and better understand crypto so I can make my own informed decisions on what I'm doing with investments and savings and looking forward. And I'm certainly not telling you to sell your house and invest in crypto. But if you have questions about financial sovereignty and the future of, well, pretty much commerce and everything else, look up the team at Bitcoin Well under the sponsors tab at ryanjesperson.com.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
Word of the Gourd. What a great Twitter handle. Word of the Gourd this morning says, Ryan, a flat tax is regressive, and it could never, ever by itself stimulate any economy. We'll find out. We'll see what the report says. Justin says, well, this is two different questions because I've asked you this morning, would you support Alberta returning to a flat tax? And I'd love to hear from Canadians in other jurisdictions too. Let me know what you think. How do you structure it in your province or territory? How do you determine what's a fair method of taxation? I said, if it would stimulate the economy, would you support a flat tax? And Justin says, well, that's two different questions. Like, would you support free ice cream for everybody if it made me 6 inches taller? He says, yes, but I'm going to need to see a chart or a graph or something that disproves existing logic and research that doesn't show causation between the two. Here's the thing about this interesting report. This has just been released this morning. This is from the team at Fraser Institute. It's an economist out of MacEwan University. We're going to be talking to him, as mentioned, in about now 25 minutes. What happens if Alberta returns to the flat tax system? And they've crunched the numbers, and they've taken a look. And we'll see what that presentation looks like. So Justin says he'd need to see causation. I think we can all agree that we could all probably get behind free ice cream. If Justin would want to be 6 inches taller, maybe that's good for him. This would probably play into our conversation yesterday with Dr. Karen Messing, right, out of Quebec, the University of Quebec at Montreal, that was talking about workplaces, how they can be a little bit less friendly to women with regards to the type of equipment or even the ergonomics involved with things like desk chairs or tools. Or we heard from surgeons yesterday, women that perform surgeries, that were letting us know, hey, there are surgical tools that either don't work or they don't work as well. They're ergonomically designed for men, but now entering the market, there are some tools specifically designed for women. It was a fascinating spin-off from yesterday's conversation. Those of you that let us know about your own personal workspaces and how they either did fit you, so to speak, or how they didn't fit you. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you have to watch that interview yesterday. She's a professor emeritus of ergonomics. Fascinating stuff from Dr. Messing. It actually prompted a great email. This from Mary Louise, who wrote into the show. You can get us to talk at ryanjesperson.com. Mary Louise says, I worked for a large organization for over 20 years. We all had the same chair, regardless of height or weight. Management just didn't seem to care that we were all different. We had different requirements. Their solution, if you wanted something outside the norm, get a doctor's note. Mary Louise said, I had to get a doctor's note for a cordless mouse. What a waste of time and money. That from Mary Louise, who signs off a Real Talker Patreon supporter. Atta girl. Thanks, Mary Louise. We sure appreciate that. Back to the question on flat tax. Yeg Beer Judge says a flat tax that stimulates the economy is a myth. It's just another piece of the debunked trickle-down theory that has ravaged low-income people at the expense of the ultra-wealthy since Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney. That's the assertion from people that would not support a flat tax, from people that would support the progressive tax that a province like Alberta currently has in place. They would say that the wealthy can afford to pay more. And it's not fair for everybody to pay 10%, a flat tax applied to all incomes, right? It's not fair because 10% of $25,000 a year or 10% of $40,000 a year is disproportionate to 10% of $285,000 a year or $3.5 million a year. Others might argue, and it could potentially be described as a Swiss cheese type argument. In other words, holes all the way through it, because the angles of approach can pick away at the assertion that, well, there's nothing more fair than the same number applied to everybody. 10% is 10% is 10%. Now, of course, the reality is that were the province to revert to or to return to a 10% flat tax, it would hurt provincial coffers. The province would collect less tax revenue. But the argument would be that it would stimulate the economy and ultimately would be better for Albertans and ultimately for Alberta's treasury. So we'll get into this. Keep the comments coming. Please do swing on by and vote on the Twitter poll. Wine Times. I mean, look at this. Look at our audience. We've got Yeg Beer Judge and Wine Times responding back to back. Look at this. Pembina and Fraser Institute, beer and wine. Everybody gathering together on Real Talk and Conversation. Wine Times says if it reduced user fees freaking everywhere, and we're talking utility delivery fees, if it attracted and then paid teachers and nurses, if it helped Albertans and businesses and led to $10 a day daycare, sure. Wine Times goes on to say increase MLAs and cabinet salaries or pay for another doomed project? Hard no. And Saxomofo Davis says, oh, Jespo, you and your crazy flat tax schemes, and uses this meme from Arrested Development. You know, other people have tried a flat tax. Maybe we should. Well, did it work for those people? No, it never does. I mean, these people somehow delude themselves into thinking it might, but it might work for us. Nice meme from Arrested Development. You know where this all started with me? Back in the talk radio days, I mean terrestrial radio, before I went from broadcast to podcast, somebody put me on the spot on a live call and said, if you were premier, what would you do? And I thought, well, I better come up with something smart, and I better come up with something quick on the fly. And I said I would introduce a sales tax in Alberta because I think it's important. And ultimately, I think that a premier in Alberta will have to do that. And I said, but here's the trade-off. You introduce a sales tax in Alberta and you balance it out with a flat tax, a flat income tax at, say, 10%. Some people blew a gasket, and that's totally fine because they said you're actually double punishing lower income earners, right? The province collects less tax revenue, 10% for the highest income earners, not nearly enough. That's the assertion. And then a sales tax, a consumer tax, a consumption tax. Well, it impacts people at the lower end of the earnings scale more so than those at the higher end, unless you're talking maybe about things like luxury taxes and the like. And I thought that that was an interesting interpretation, and this is the type of thing that I've thought about. And so I'm wide open to hearing about this argument, this report, and that's coming up in about 20 minutes' time. Sam, I can see this has caught your interest. I can see you're intrigued by the conversation. Is this something that you've chewed on? I mean, is this something that you've put some thought into? Do you have a position on it?
I've thought about sales taxes a lot. I think it's, probably absolutely Alberta needs a sales tax. I'm not going to go any further than that. Alberta needs a sales tax. Also, the thing about things like consumption taxes and sales taxes is there's mechanisms that you can bake into them to make them less regressive, right?
Yep.
So when we talk about it impacting people at the bottom, I mean, even look at the way that we administer GST. You don't pay GST on food. You don't pay GST on important household items. You shouldn't pay GST on menstrual products.
Well, and you can also get refunds.
Yes, exactly. And, whereas a flat tax is like, it kind of feels like this solution that makes nobody happy because, as you asserted, you either set a flat tax at a rate where it is low enough that the lowest earners, the people that are the most vulnerable in society can afford to pay it, but then you don't really generate any meaningful revenue out of it.
So the trade-off has to be for government. Government has to believe that it'll kickstart the economy enough to make it worth it in the long run.
Yeah, but then I mean and then on the high end earners are, paying far less than they should be right now, and it creates another revenue hole. So I'm very much into progressive taxation.
Can we also say that that's a matter of opinion?
Sure.
For people to say, and this is, I feel, what I feel like I'm doing? I feel like I'm walking around the smoldering grounds of a wildfire. Like the fire, I feel like the fire is burned through, but there's still some ash blowing around, and there's still sparks, and I feel like I'm carrying a couple jerry cans in my hand as I'm making these arguments. But I will say, like it or not, it is a matter of opinion, and don't stamp this on my tombstone, but it's a matter of opinion that 10% is not enough tax for the wealthy to pay, or that the wealthy don't pay enough tax. Now, I know people are going to lose it and say the uber wealthy can afford to pay way more. Jeff Bezos going to space, he can afford to pay more income tax. And you'd be hard-pressed to make the argument that big, massive multinational corporations, the biggest companies in the world, do pay enough tax, because even in Alberta, even across Canada, we'll see massive corporations with huge profits that are getting major tax breaks. We see incentives offered by government that do not translate into jobs, that do not translate into economic stimulus. Just look what's happened with oil and gas, right? Look where Encana is right now. The hint, not in Canada anymore, right? Did they see some tax breaks? Did they see some incentives? They sure as hell did. And some of the news coverage over the past couple of weeks has been Alberta's premier. And the reporting in the editorials has been Alberta's premier begs oil and gas companies to plug profits back into things like job incentives and economic stimulus. Alberta's premier is trying to convince these oil and gas leaders that have seen good faith from the Alberta government to return the goodwill, so to speak. But that's not always the way it goes. But when we talk about personal income tax, devil's advocate, sure. But can you automatically assert that someone is or is not paying enough income tax, or is it a matter of opinion? Maybe that should be a separate Twitter poll. But right now, we'll stick with the one that we've got going on. Would you support Alberta returning to a flat tax system if it proved to stimulate the economy? The most interesting poll result I saw as soon as I hit send on it, as soon as I hit tweet, we had 3 votes, and 2 of the votes were yes. Yes, they would support the flat tax. So with 3 votes, it was 66% in favor. Now, since we've started talking with 468 votes, 62% say no. The yeses are slightly dropping. The yeses are chipping away. Now at 29.9, we'll call it 30%, and 8% of you say it depends. We'll get to more of that in just a little bit. First, we're going to talk about healthy cities in the era of doorstep delivery. That's coming up in just a moment. Right now, I want to remind you that the team at St. Albert and Sherwood Dodge is ready right now. Dealerships don't have to be open. I mean, they are open as we speak, and they're probably open as you're listening to this later in the day, but they're always open online. If you go to ryanjesperson.com and you click on our sponsors tab, you'll find the logos for all of the Real Talk builders. These are the organizations that have stepped up to make sure that we can have these conversations, important ones, every day. There's St. Albert and Sherwood Dodge. Right at the top, you click on the link, and there they are. New vehicles, pre-owned. You can schedule your service appointment. You can buy a vehicle from home. Great incentives on the Jeep brand all the way through. Look at this. Even a live chat option if you'd like to chat with a sales or service associate. St. Albert and Sherwood Dodge, always open online via the sponsors tab at ryanjesperson.com. Also, big shout out to the teams at the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. You show up there at Palisades, Nemeo, Newcastle, Westmount, Y Gardens, or Baseline Road. You drop my name, Jespo, or Real Talk, and you're going to get 2 cheeseburgers for $5 or 2 doubles for $7. And I probably don't have to go on and on and on about all the amazing cool treats they've got. The Jespo recommendation today, because I heard that it's a thing and I can't even believe it. I haven't tried it yet, but I'll recommend it blind, is the Kit Kat Blizzard. You can find them at the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. Make sure you tell them that Jespo sent you. Okay, so here we go. It's fair to say that consumer habits have changed dramatically over the past number of years. Is that fair to say with you, whether it's the way that you get your food, whether it's the way that you order your books, whether it's the way that you top up on household supplies? More and more people around the world are ordering online and having the products delivered to their door. It's the so-called doorstep delivery era. So what does a healthy city look like in the era? Building healthy cities in the doorstep delivery era, sustainable urban freight solutions from around the world, a new report for the Pembina Institute. That's where Saeed Kaddoura is a senior analyst, kind enough to join us this morning. Welcome to the program, and thanks for being here on Real Talk.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. It's definitely a pleasure to be here.
Saeed, I know, our family, we try to find this balance, right, between shopping local, supporting local, and also acknowledging, in some cases, what's just the most convenient way to go. And we've tried to find this balance, but our family certainly a participant in what you'd call the doorstep delivery era. How about you?
I think most definitely. And what we've been seeing in the pandemic is that buying local and online shopping could be the same thing. Anytime we're on Uber Eats, you're trying to find those like one-of-a-kind restaurants, mom-and-pop restaurants. Obviously, sometimes we veer into the land of fast food, but that's out of desperation usually.
Yeah, that's right. Well, listen, we're really excited to have you here because it was just a few years ago that you were named as one of Corporate Knight's top 30 under 30 leaders across the country in sustainability. And I know that a lot of your research has covered decarbonization of the electricity, transportation, and building sectors. And so it might seem obvious, but how does that fit into this report? I mean, you approach this from the angle, I'm assuming, of emissions, vehicle traffic, waste. Did you talk about packaging? I mean, there's probably a lot of ways that we can approach this.
Of course. So really, my work at the Pembina Institute revolves around the energy sector. So when we're looking at the doorstep delivery kind of phenomenon here, we focused on transportation emissions, the demand for transportation energy, and of course the emissions that come out as a result. We veered a little bit as well into looking at things such as social equity, environmental, social justice, as well as safety. I mean, more trucks on the road, of course, creates more of a risky environment for pedestrians. So tried to really take a little bit of a holistic holistic look, centering on the energy perspective first, but veering on really what are some of the elements that make up our cities, how our cities are designed, the curb space, the cars on the road, and some of the policies that help us just be a little bit forward thinking in how our cities should look like 10 years from now.
Did the pandemic, there were kind of interesting parallel storylines, weren't there? Because in some cases around the world, people would say when the globe, and whenever I use words like shutdown or lockdown, we get emails from people saying, please be accurate. There was never actually a full lockdown. And I can see the point. There was still activity. There was still commerce. People could still move freely. But the fact of the matter is, whether you were talking about canals in Venice or whether you were talking about dolphin populations in certain places off the coastal waters of Japan, or there were a ton of other examples, people were saying nature is healing. The planet is taking a breath. And there is evidence of the planet. There are certain areas where there was environmental recovery. And then on the flip side, way more delivery activity, right? Way more online sales. How did you reconcile that? I mean, did you take a look at those two storylines?
So I would say, I think the biggest differentiator, when we look at climate change, it's really a global phenomenon, right? Now, the impact of online shopping had a really drastic effect on our cities, which is our dense urban environments, which are usually a lot harder to I don't want to say return back to normal. I mean, we've got pavements, we've got buildings. I've seen examples where nature has you've seen some animals like make it to the city and people got excited like, oh, nature is taking over. That's great. But really, when we look at our dense building environments or dense cities, what we saw is actually a big, more of a shift to more vehicles, a little bit more of a little bit more air pollution. Of course, not when everybody was still driving, but delivery trucks are some of the more polluting kind of vehicles out there. So I think on the bigger picture, there has been a sense of recovery, but kind of like this environmental recovery. But I think the impacts that we've seen from things like online shopping, once things go back to normal, they really are here to stay. Some studies have shown that our shopping habits, the online shopping habits that we've taken on, are really going to become permanent. Studies from the UK show that 75% of consumers said that really their online shopping habits that they've adopted in the pandemic are here to stay. So it's a little bit about kind of not just focusing on the 12 months or 24 months that we just experienced, but really thinking about what has the pandemic accelerated, such as this shift towards more online shopping, and what are the ways that they're going to affect our cities, and what are the ways that we can recover as well from those really moving forward.
Did you see, when your team took a look at this, did you see with regards to an influx of delivery trucks or increased traffic, did you note tangible impacts on cities? Like, could you point to an example where you would say this was not a factor before, but post-pandemic, this is a factor now?
I think most definitely, and I would point to the very obvious one, which is the evolution of the curbside space, right? Which is the space between the street and the storefront. Before the pandemic, this was just a place where people used to walk and where cars used to park, and that's great. But what we're seeing right now is a much more dynamic perspective of what a curbside looks like. So curbside space now isn't just shared by delivery trucks. I mean, we also have ride-sharing vehicles use the space. Curbside pickup now is becoming a big thing in a lot of companies. I think Target has seen their curbside pickup offering grow by 7 times. Of course, it maybe wasn't a big thing that they were thinking about before, but it's still a big growth. And I think also one thing that's worth noting is that this idea of patio restaurants really has been important for the success and recovery of some businesses. So what we're seeing isn't just that the curbside itself is changing, but it's actually turning into this evolving space that's dynamic and mixed use. And we really have to think about how the space really is being used, and how regulation in cities is allowing different types of vehicles to use the space and really enable those types of different activities as they evolve.
You're bang on. I mean, I'm thinking of examples right now off the top of my head across the country where Some typical traffic lanes, in other words, vehicle traffic, have been closed down for bike lanes or increased pedestrian spaces. We've seen some areas in downtown cities that have been vehicle thoroughfares that have been completely shut down to traffic and turned into these wonderful, almost gathering spaces, like you said, with the patio areas that have allowed for recovery of some hospitality institutions or some of our favorite restaurants and hotels. And I think for a lot of people, it's going to be difficult to surrender those, isn't it? People aren't going to have an appetite to surrender that because they've become used to it. So what does this mean? I mean, does this mean that we require kind of like a dramatic reimagining of municipal design?
I think I would say a dramatic reimagining is pretty accurate, and there's good news and there's bad news, right? The bad news is that whatever we do, whatever we take on, in terms of both managing emissions, but also managing the rising number of trucks on the road, needs to be adopted pretty dramatically. If we think about emissions, 90% of transportation-based energy still relies on fossil fuels. In Canada specifically, our transportation emissions is the second largest emitting sector. No surprise after the oil and gas sector. And goods movement specifically contributes to around, it's actually the second highest emitting subsector, so transportation for moving goods. So I think whatever we do needs to be dramatically scaled. Now, the good news here is that the solutions to these problems exist, and they have been in play around the world for decades now. So things like low emission zones that allow either non-emitting or low-emitting vehicles to enter, smaller delivery vehicles, for example, have been in play in London and Paris and are very popular in Europe. We already have zero-emission vehicles that exist. It's just about really cities investing both in the funding as well as the regulatory reform to make these solutions actually scale up and adoptable. And for us to really think, how could we adopt those from the perspective of city planning to start with, and not really look at them as the end of pipe, really solutions to problems that have emerged.
So, Saeed, are we talking about, I mean, is it as simple as instead of a big, GMC 5-ton cube van, you've got 11 Teslas doing the delivery? I mean, is that what we're talking about?
I mean, there's really three buckets of solutions. One of them is exactly like you described, zero-emission vehicles. So what I say is we want to replace bigger emitting trucks with smaller, cleaner vehicles. So that's either smaller or cleaner, or smaller and cleaner. So zero-emission trucks when possible. Also, not necessarily Teslas, but you can go even smaller. So delivery cargo bikes, as an example, which are these electric-assisted tricycles that have a basket on the front. These are becoming really popular for making last mile deliveries specifically, and they're a great replacement for trucks. So one aspect of that is really this replacing those trucks with cleaner vehicles. The other one is also around rethinking when we make deliveries and also how those deliveries are being distributed. I mean, imagine if garbage trucks collected garbage in the middle of rush hour. That would be inconvenient, right? So some cities have actually piloted doing deliveries to grocery stores after 9 p.m., times where the traffic is a little bit less. That leads to less congestion. And of course, less cruising time trying to find parking, which leads to less emissions. So there's a couple of ways that we can tackle that, not necessarily just on the vehicle side, but also thinking about how we make deliveries as well.
So this is, I mean, like similar to lawmakers in California saying, hey, listen, with these massive strains on the power grid, we're asking everybody to run your dishwashers or run your washers and dryers after 5 p.m. outside of peak hours. That same sort of idea, but transplanted into a delivery methodology.
I would say almost exactly, yes, of course. And the idea behind getting people to shift their electricity use to different times is it's cheaper to produce the electricity. Then it also creates less emissions because you're depending less on what we call peaker plants that use fossil fuels. So the idea is the same. In this case, what you're doing is you're thinking about your 24-hour day, thinking about when is the best time to perform this activity in a way that it's cheaper and also emits less. So I would say that's a great parallel to draw from.
Do you typically see evidence that people get on board with this? Like, I guess you don't have to sell the public on things like, would you rather have more available patio space, or would you rather, would you prefer to have fewer delivery trucks downtown at noon? Everyone's going to say, well, yeah, sure, it all sounds great, right? But the business owner is going to sit there and say, yeah, but I need the courier here right now. Or I've got, Icelandic cod coming in fresh from the airport, or flash frozen, let's say, but it needs to get here right now because my seafood special starts tonight and I need the delivery immediately. Right? You've got to get this. These may be small things and they may be described as inconveniences, or you need to be able to pivot. But at the same time, you would need the public on board, right? There needs to be sometimes we might even call it a political will or a societal will, or, does that exist, do you think?
So there's a couple of things there. I think every problem, it kind of could have its own unique solution, right? It's not that we want to implement everything for everybody. So from a business owner's perspective, of course, the motivations are going to differ. What we've seen from, so you remember I was saying some of these pilots have actually been in place. So there are analyses and results on how effective this has been. And what we've seen is it's actually saved some businesses money. It's been more convenient for people to get their deliveries at different times. So I would say it really depends on the case, but what we found is typically, and one of the reasons why we talk sometimes about a green recovery is that green recovery it could be considered in some situations more equitable. The results that we've been seeing is that businesses are able to operate more efficiently to get their deliveries, I think, without necessary delay. More trucks on the road does mean more congestion. So a study from the Smart Freight Center in Ontario found that they're able to make deliveries more quickly when they're delivering off-peak. They did an off-peak pilot, I believe, in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. And they found that it was actually more efficient. So I think if we want to talk about the political will, it's not a very contentious idea to want to help businesses to operate more efficiently. And I think you touched on a really important point, and it's the fact that really the silver key to making a lot of these solutions happen is what we call public-private partnerships, which is essentially jargon for cities and companies working together. So if you have cities really creating the funding and regulatory environment that's going to enable these pilots to operate efficiently, and companies coming on board to say, you know what, this is something that I'm willing to test to see if this works, not only is it going to give us a chance to reduce some of the impacts, but it's also going to give us learnings about how to improve, how to make it better, and to adopt different solutions. So it's really, so that's really the key around companies and cities working together. And then I think if there's a positive impact, that it's just natural that it's going to be adopted.
We're talking to Saeed Kaddoura, contributor, author of this report for the Pembina Institute, with partners, the National Association of City Transportation Officials and Bloomberg Associates. Saeed, whenever we talk about, it seems to me, I shouldn't say whenever, but when we're talking about reports like this, people will oftentimes describe them as an attack on someone, right? So right now, people may describe this as, and I'm not saying this, I'm having a little fun with you, but people will say, well, this is an attack on truckers. No, this is an attack on the transportation industry. Or, in so many ways, as in 5 minutes when I talk about a flat tax, it will be an attack on the poor. And then we'll talk, and then I don't think our conversation with legendary Canadian Rick Hansen in half an hour will be an attack on anyone. But I digress. You get what I'm saying. People are going to sit here and say, well, hang on a second. What does this mean for all the truckers? What does this mean for everybody else that's going to be affected by this? How do you help, or how do you assist people in pivoting, whether we're talking about people working in the oil and gas industry pivoting to a career in sustainable energy, or whether we're talking about truckers pivoting to new methodology or new city building when it comes to deliveries and shipping and receiving? How does a city or a province, a nation, why do we say, how does a jurisdiction actually put this into practice and ensure that people's livelihoods aren't harmed?
Mm-hmm. I think I mean, I'm gonna draw from your parallel. We saw this kind of with the coal phase out in Alberta, and really any energy transition and any transition in general. You're always gonna have winners and losers, right? And it's really about thinking about that and making sure that the people that are affected have some sort of mechanism to participate in this transition. So what we saw with the coal phase out, as an example, is programs for retraining or bridging to retirement. There are specific policies that are put in place so that we have much more winners and much less losers, of course. But the nature of a transition in itself is that some people are going to be affected and some people are going to be benefited. So I think in this case, it's definitely not different. And one thing to mention as an example, traditionally transportation infrastructure such as how do we say, like so highways and such, but also store warehouses, distribution centers have been disproportionately placed in areas of low income or communities of color. So what this actually gives us an opportunity in the transition is to consider, okay, what are the types of inequities that we have? This is a time for us to pivot, and how can we actually redesign the way that we design our cities, or reconsider how we design our cities to minimize some of these inequities. So if you're talking about truck drivers as an example, if we think about this movement towards things like delivery drones or automatic delivery vehicles, automated delivery vehicles, ADVs as they call, we might have less truck drivers, but we might have more truck engineers or people who do automation, who work in sensors. So those are much higher paying, higher quality jobs that exist. So I think one of the ways that we can focus is to bridge between what was before and what is now, and to also realize that those workers are going to be affected. How can we bring them into the future? But also to realize that some of these jobs are going to be higher paying, more stable jobs. In the energy transition, we refer to renewable energy, which is, I believe, the only energy source that actually, or type of energy development that grew during the pandemic. There are much more stable jobs that are less susceptible to the oil and gas boom bust economy. So they may not be as high paying, but they are actually more stable. So I think we have to think about the types of jobs that are being created. Are they better jobs? Are they more stable jobs? And also to think about the people that are losing in this transition, and how can we bring them along with us so that everybody's winning.
I think it's so important that you use the word opportunity, and you make such a great point about the communities typically where some of these delivery centers are located, and I mean, your team's come up with a ton of recommendations. People need to check out this resource from the Pembina Institute. You talk about delivery micro hubs and parcel lockers, digital support for businesses, and then you get into really, really big ones. I mean, we could talk for 5 hours on this, but waterway logistics hubs and subsurface tunnel networks, and these are big ones that would cost hundreds of millions, or bold ideas, and maybe even billions of dollars. And people could say, okay, well, these are actually really neat ideas and they're great, but who's going to pay for them? So how do you see some of this infrastructure being covered? Does it start with almost if I use this word, if I use this phrase, Saeed, what's going to happen? But if we took the idea of a carbon tax and applied it to things like, I know, but if we priced the carbon on things like online deliveries, is that what you'd be looking to? I mean, essentially, who pays for it?
So I think that's a great point, and I always say this. I mean, online shopping isn't this new thing. It's been around since the 1990s, right? It emerged as a disruptive business model. Amazon was founded in 1994, eBay in 1995, and Alibaba in 1999. So it's something that's been growing. But what we've been seeing recently is a much bigger or like a fiercer competition towards faster delivery. What was standard delivery, 2 to 3 days a few years ago, now is trending towards 1 day shipping and even expedited shipping. So really, expedited same-day shipping, I should say. So really what that means is a single package on a single truck is traveling from Babies R Us to make it to your doorstep the same day. So something like a tax for really fast shipping could actually fund some of these programs that, or fund some of these companies to invest in the necessary technologies to come into play. So yes, taxation in a way for something that's a little bit more expedited. I think this pressure for really fast shipping makes it really hard for retailers to adopt some of these sustainable solutions. So that is one way to do it. But I think it's important to also think funding is definitely important, but there are things that could be done simply through regulatory reform. Something that the city of Toronto did recently is it allowed loading zones in the city not only to accept trucks, but also to accept cargo bikes. This is something that doesn't cost money, but it tells companies to say, hey, if you're delivering by a cargo bike, you can park in this loading zone instead of taking a curbside space away from, let's say, a taxi as an example. So there is a combination. Funding is definitely important and paramount, but at the same time, there are some creative solutions that we could do that just enable some of these solutions to come online.
You can read more about this report by visiting the Pembina Institute online at pembina.org, Building Healthy Cities in the Doorstep-Delivery Era. Grateful to have Saeed Kaddoura joining us. I was reading up on you. It's like whenever I see that somebody has more than one grad degree in engineering, I go, oh yeah, that's somebody I got to talk to. Really appreciate your perspective. And I'll be honest with you right now, my head, I'm envisioning what things like this would look like. And that's the whole point of a report like this, isn't it? To start thinking outside of how we've designed cities or outside of our standard consumer habits. So mission accomplished.
Thank you so much. And now's the time to really think about what the future of our cities look like. And we're really in a pivotal transformational moment. So let's just take advantage of the Great Reset, as they call it.
Perfect. There you go. Saeed Kaddoura, you bet. The Great Reset. I know that's going to get a lot of people going too, because you remember people started talking about the Great Reset. Like, what does that actually mean with regards to the economy? But can we all agree that this pandemic, that let's call it a 2-year window, that these 2 years will have been an opportunity for many of us, or the impetus for many of us in some circumstances you did not have a choice about reinventing yourself or changing the way that you operated, or adopting new personal habits, or maybe saying goodbye and flushing away some longstanding personal habits? You can let me know what you think. This is great. James loved the guest. Emma says, thanks, Saeed. Perfect. Keep the comments coming. Emma says, I like that idea a lot, by the way. Trevor says it's more about having truck drivers carry things other than oil tankers, not retraining them to be engineers. Wally says, why do we never talk about alleyway use? You don't take up sidewalks or curbsides, have delivery vans come in through the back. Rethink design and traffic within. The only thing is, Wally, in a lot of cities, alleyways are now being reinvented as major pedestrian zones with fabulous opportunities, again, for restaurants or retail locations. I mean, in some cases, you're seeing entire districts. I don't know what they call them, not alley districts, but something along those lines where it's off the main drag, but still it allows for this beautiful environment. So reimagine, re-envision. You can let me know what you think. If you'd rather not risk your comment just evaporating away on our live chat, you can always use our hashtag RealTalkRJ, or of course, you can send us an email to talk@ryanjesperson.com. That hashtag is sponsored. It's powered, as you know, by the team at Park Power, and we are more than happy. And as a matter of fact, we're thrilled to be partnered with Park Power because we love the fact that they take 10% of their electricity profits and they plug them back into nonprofits in the communities where we all live and work here across the province of Alberta. Park Power delivering electricity, natural gas, and internet. And if you visit their website, parkpower.ca, right now, you can compare rates to see how what you're currently paying for these services might change were you to take your business over to Park Power. And don't forget, if and when you sign up, use the promo code 2021-Real Talk, and you'll get $70 off your first bill. Also wanted to give a big shout out to the team at Fraser Brothers. For more than 65 years, they've been Alberta grown and Alberta owned. 16 locations across the province now, including this big, beautiful store in South Edmonton. Follow Friesen Brothers on Instagram at Friesen Bros. You look back a couple of posts and you'll see this one. where they announced their own Fraser Brothers branded Alberta-made barbecue sauce. I tried it over the weekend. As a matter of fact, we got into a couple different ones of them. We went with the Fraser Brothers. They do the butchers will put those burger patties together for you, and they're just absolutely unbelievable. I did my burgers, by the way, had some company over, and I cooked my burgers maybe for one of the first times in my life to medium.
Oh.
Yes.
Yes.
It felt very American of me.
Nice.
But I
You left
trusted
a
it.
pink.
Yeah, it's just it's the tiniest little bit of pink, not raw, but just the tiniest little bit of pink. And again, that's what the Americans do, right? We don't do it so much in Canada.
That's true. There are different, I mean, you go to different parts of the world, there are different, like a steak, you can order your burger in different grades.
But the meat quality was
yes.
so good that we cooked the burgers to medium, and they were fantastic. Well, here's why that Instagram post matters. If you go right now, check out this post with the barbecue sauce, follow Fraser Brothers on Instagram, follow me at Ryan Jesperson, and then leave a comment on the post about what you'd love to throw on the grill from Fraser Brothers. Every day this week, we're going to be picking one Real Talker that's going to win a Fraser Brothers barbecue prize pack. Look at this. For pickup at the South Edmonton store, we will notify you day by day, courtesy of our friends at Fraser Brothers. All right, let's check in on my Twitter poll. I'm going to see how this goes. And we're asking you today, and this is leading up to a conversation in about 30 seconds from now with an economist out of MacEwan University authoring a report for the Fraser Institute. Would you support Alberta returning to a flat tax system? In other words, hypothetically, 10% for everybody when it comes to provincial income tax, as opposed to the progressive tax rate introduced in 2015 by then Premier Rachel Notley, which sees the highest income earners paying 15%. Would you support Alberta returning to a flat tax system if it proved to stimulate the economy? 26% of respondents say yes. 66% of respondents, we'll call it 2 and 3, say no. And about 7.5%, we'll call it 8% of you, say, well, it depends. Stephen Carter, former chief of staff for former Premier Alison Redford, has chimed in and says a flat tax did not stimulate the economy. It gave rich people more money. Kevin says, well, it's a high volatility strategy. There could be huge fluctuations in government revenue or public standards. If you can handle the uncertainty and the risk, then sure. But if you prefer systemic stability, predictability, then no. The good times being better, the bad times being worse is not acceptable. That from Kevin. That's a thoughtful response. I appreciate that. No Drones Canada says, it's a laugh. Says, what's the purpose of the economy if it doesn't give benefits to most people? Flat taxes benefit the richest among us. Their wealth does not trickle down. Flat taxes create more wealth inequality and undermine democracy. Wow. That from No Drones Canada. All right. Well, the author of this report, kind enough to join us this morning. And it's a pleasure to welcome a professor of economics out of MacEwan University, a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute, Dr. Ergete Ferede. Welcome to the show, my friend. I suspect I may have mispronounced your name. Can you help me out on this one? How do I properly pronounce it?
Ergete Ferede. You got it right.
Perfect. Well, welcome to the show, and thank you very much. Let me tell you, you and I find ourselves in hostile territory right now. The numbers show that not only does not everybody love the idea of a flat tax, but a lot of people believe that because this is coming from the Fraser Institute, that it is influenced by the Koch brothers and the uber wealthy, and they can't take it. It's not worth the paper that it's printed on. What do you say to the detractors right out of the gates?
Thank you for having me, Ryan. I mean, as you remember, before 2015, we had a flat tax system where we had 10% flat income tax or single income tax rate for everybody. So that changed in 2015 with the new NDP government. And the new NDP government, as you remember, it introduced a progressive income tax system. So the question is, some people argue that that move by the government eroded what was the Alberta tax advantage. So the question is, if we want to regain part of the Alberta tax advantage, what happens if we return to the previous flat income tax system? That means the single income tax rate system. So my research focus on this particular issue. What happens? How will Alberta be affected? How will the Alberta government provincial budget will be affected? So my research, that's the focus of my research. So there are economic benefits, and as some of your viewers said, there are also costs associated with going back to the flat income tax system. So I'll be happy to explain the costs associated with that and also the benefits of going to the flat income tax system. It has both costs and benefits. We have to weigh both the costs and benefits associated with that.
Sure, and it's fair to talk about pros and cons and costs
Exactly.
and benefits, obviously, but is a flat tax inherently harmful to the poor or harmful to low-income earners and immediately automatically only beneficial to the wealthy? I mean, that's how it's being understood, perceived, and described by a lot of people chiming in on my Twitter poll today.
Exactly. You are right. When you look at it, so for example, if we cut the personal income tax from 15% to 10%, when you look at superficially, it will be the high income earner who will benefit. However, if the economy is stimulated, if the economy creates more jobs, if more entrepreneurial activities are created in the province, that will create more jobs and ordinary Albertans can also benefit. So what happens is that people usually, they look at who directly benefit from the income tax, but they don't look at those who indirectly benefit when economic activities increase, entrepreneurial activities increase, and more jobs are created in the province. So I think it depends on how we view the issue. So we have to look at all issues.
I can understand how people may say if a high income earner saves money on taxes, it makes more money available for either more hiring or for expenditures on luxury items that could glean larger sales taxes, etc. But you know the counterpoint, because I'm seeing it a whole bunch this morning from people saying this is trickle down. I mean, this is Ronald Reagan 101, and it's been disproven many, many times. It doesn't work. Trickle down does not happen. What would you say to those people?
It's a good point. It's a good question, Ryan. One of the most important challenges of selling the idea of reducing any income tax, if you want to reduce any income tax, is very challenging because people see only one side of the problem, one side of the issue. So the same applies for income tax. So in my research, when I have found that when income tax rate is reduced, more economic activities occur, more jobs will be created, more entrepreneurial activities will be created. As for example, entrepreneurs, they can take more risks, they can invest more. All of this will stimulate the economy and create jobs. So when more jobs are created, who will benefit? Of course, ordinary Albertans can benefit. Yes, when you look at it at first, it looks like it's only beneficial for high-income earners. But when you go deep into the problem, deep into the issue, in fact, ordinary Albertans also can benefit from such a policy move.
Okay, so why don't we talk, if we're going to say the costs and the benefit of the pros or the cons, why don't we start with the pros first? Why don't we start actually by understanding the landscape? What does your report show would be the budgetary or the revenue implications for the Alberta government were it to return to a 10% flat tax? What would that mean for Alberta's bottom line? It would obviously take a hit.
Exactly. You are right. That's a very good question. And then actually, this is the most important issue that people care about, and in fact, policymakers also care about. What is the cost? What is the catch? When we go from the current progressive income tax system to the flat tax system, what will be the catch? Now, in my research, I assume, for example, if the provincial government gradually returns to the flat tax system over a 4-year period, so by cutting, let's say, from 15% to 14% the first year, from 14% to 13% the second year, from 13% to 12% the third year, and from 12% to 10% the fourth year, in the first year, the provincial government will lose about $16 million. So that is not that much. But at the end of the reform, the provincial government will lose about $1.36 billion. So you are right, there is a revenue loss. There is a budgetary implication. But when you look at this in perspective, this is roughly 9% as compared to the no-base scenario. So when you compare the revenue loss, which is around 1.36 or $1.4 billion, and the main economic benefits that come with the tax move, this revenue loss is marginal. It is not cheap, of course, but it has economic benefits. But the loss is roughly about $1.4 billion. That is a budgetary implication.
Albertans have seen, though, I mean, I think it's fair to say Albertans have seen evidence that oftentimes tax breaks do not translate into stimulated economic activity for the province. And I look to some of the tax breaks that have been granted to big oil as an example. We've seen it doesn't turn into hiring. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even guarantee that companies are going to stick around, that companies are going to stay in Alberta. We've seen oil companies enjoy big tax breaks over the past year and a half, past couple of years, and some of them have ultimately packed their bags and moved south. So what would lead the general public to believe that it would be any different on an individual or personal income tax level?
Very interesting question. The issue is if you look at it from a business perspective, income tax is only one of the elements they take into account. So if you are, for example, investing in the energy sector, yes, the tax rate matters. The corporate income tax matters. The income tax rate matters. But these are only one of the important issues they take into account. They look at also other issues, other important factors play a significant role in the decision-making of businesses. So when we reduce the income tax rate, boom, it doesn't automatically increase the business activity because other things have to be taken into account. So my study suggests that if other things remaining the same, for example, if other things remaining the same, and we reduce the income tax rate, then we can see an improvement in economic activity. We can see, for example, if the income tax rate is low, corporations they may want to locate themselves. The head offices will be located in Alberta. With that comes jobs, for example. Entrepreneurs, businesses, they want to take more risk. They can invest more. All of this can stimulate the economy, and ordinary Albertans, they can benefit from the job creation associated with that. Again, tax rate is only one of the issues that business take into account. I'm assuming here other things are remaining the same. You are right. If we reduce the income tax rate and oil price crash, then we will lose this kind of benefit. If other things, bad things happen, for example, you can think of the corporate income tax rate cut we saw last time. But that corporate income tax cut coincided with the pandemic. So we didn't see the full benefit of the lower corporate income tax. So as you have raised, it is important to take into account other considerations. So the lower income tax rate that I'm talking about is assuming other things are remaining the same. So
let me ask you this, Dr. Ferede. So you'll have lower income earners, or they don't have to be lower income earners. You can have anybody saying, hang on a second, though, if the government's going to take a $1.4 billion hit on revenue by implementing this, and let's be honest, the government would, I mean, you've got the premier saying if they're going to introduce something like a sales tax, I mean, he never would, I don't think, or at least it would be a last resort. It would be the type of thing that they would believe, it would have to go to a referendum. At the very least, it would be something that you'd have to campaign on in an election, I think, if you're not going to lose the goodwill of the people. And so you have to sell the public on this. And you'll have people, probably, I'm going to say everybody earning less than $300,000 a year is probably going to have some concerns about this. Or let's say, lower than $250,000 a year. And one of the big concerns is going to be if you take the hit on the revenue side, you're going to have fewer money to disperse to programs. And one of the ways that it will translate, if not cuts, is user fees. And user fees will disproportionately punish the lower income earners or people on tight budgets, regular folks with families and other financial obligations. That would be one of the cons. How do you, quote unquote, sell this to the public? If people aren't, they're not going to believe in the trickle down thing. There's going to be a lot of cynicism there. Going to see the track record of tax cuts. I'll acknowledge your point about lower oil prices, but the point is tax cuts and holidays and breaks have not necessarily proven to provide that security. So how do you address the obvious impact on lower income earners here? How does the government address that?
I think this is a legitimate question. This is a legitimate concept, particularly now. The Alberta government is in the red. We are in budget deficit. We have been for a while. So selling this idea of going to the flat tax system at this time may be very challenging. It is true. So when the economy is in trouble like now, when the oil price is very low and the non-renewable resource revenue is very low. Selling this idea of going to the flat tax system is very challenging and very difficult. Admittedly, it's very difficult. For example, historically, we collect about 20% of our revenue from non-renewable resource revenue. Now, because of the crash in oil price, we collect only 7%. About 7% of Alberta's revenue come from non-renewable resource revenue at the current in the current budget. So that means if we go to the flat tax system and we incur a $1.4 billion loss, it can have a negative impact on social services, for example, or the government has to get the revenue from other sources. Now, this is a challenge, of course. We have to look at the timing. When should we engage in this kind of reform? That's an important issue. Now, so even if it is very difficult to engage in this kind of tax reform now, the government can also look at this as a long-term proposal, a long-term idea. Okay, for example, when the pandemic is over, for example, when everything goes back to normal, and when we are managing our budgets properly, then we can have an additional tool to stimulate economic activities and create more jobs in the province by going to the flat tax system. And that will make Alberta the province with the lowest tax rate in the country. And in fact, as compared to other North American states, it will make the Alberta the jurisdiction with the lowest tax rate. That is one way. Now, so this is a long-term goal. This is a long-term proposal. It may not be feasible now, but it can be feasible in the future. Now, I may add one more thing here. If budgetary implication precludes this kind of bold reform idea, the government can also engage in a minor tax reform. And that minor tax reform affects only a very small number of people. And that is, let's say, we cut the top income tax bracket. We go from 15% to 14%, not going all the way to the flat tax rate. Okay? That will make the province with the lowest tax rate, and we can regain part of the Alberta tax advantage. So yes, timing is very important. I understand politically, socially, and economically, it's very challenging to engage in this kind of tax reform now, but this is something that we should talk about. When the time is right, we can regain part of our lost Alberta tax advantage.
Dr. Ergete Ferede is an economist out of MacEwan University, professor there, and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. That brand new report just out this morning. You can check it out online. Just follow the links on my Twitter. Thanks so much for making the time to talk to us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for that. Thank you very much for having me, Ryan.
Yeah, you bet. That's a tough one. That's an interesting one. That's an interesting perspective. I would say politically, the toughest sell would be, like he says, a slight break in the highest tax bracket, or a slight break in the highest tax bracket alone from 15 to 14%. Political opponents to this government would be salivating. I mean, it would be worth it for them, for the government's revenue to take a hit, for the government, the conservative government, to implement that policy, wouldn't it? Because what's the spin? What's the messaging on that? They only gave a tax break to literally only the highest income earners. I don't know about that one. But generally speaking, would you support it or not? It's great to see former Alberta Party MLA Karen McPherson chiming in on this. She says, no flat tax. On my Twitter, she says it's a regressive approach to taxation that overwhelmingly benefits very wealthy people. Mokins says no tax breaks for the wealthy. They don't create jobs. There's mountains of evidence that shows it just concentrates wealth. Flat tax rates target lower earners. A millionaire can afford a tax of $100K on their million, but a person making 20 grand finds it a lot tougher to hand over $2. Edmund Acuto says, oh, that old chestnut being regurgitated by the Fraser Institute. I see. Well, it has been a while. You can let me know what you think. I encourage you to, I would say don't hold your tongues, but you're not. That's great. It's brilliant. It's wonderful. It's why we have these conversations. We could have all of these placid, benign, meaningless, boring conversations devoid of controversy, but who wants to have those? Would you support Alberta returning to a flat tax system if it proved to stimulate the economy? The poll is open on my Twitter right now. It's been open for, what is it, an hour and change, an hour and 15 minutes. We got it closing in on 1,000 votes. 66% of you say no. That number's been holding strong. 27% say yes. And 7% say it depends. Keep the comments coming. We'll revisit this a little bit later on the show. I want to remind you that Trash Talk is coming up on Friday. I wonder if we'll get a couple of Trash Talk submissions based on that most recent conversation. I would love to see it. I mean, a lot of you respond to the conversations we have here on the show, but you write in, they're not necessarily trash talk. For example, I got an email here from Sandy on forest management agreements, logging in Alberta's forests, and we're going to get to that a little bit later, but it's not a trash talk email. It's just like logical and laying out some points. But if you want to blow off a little steam, send your rant to us. The shorter, the better. To talk at ryanjesperson.com. The team at Local Waste loves to talk trash. They've been doing it for more than a quarter century, locally owned and operating right here in Western Canada. The call out is on two fronts. Number one, if your business could stand to have a better relationship, maybe see more benefit from your partner here, whoever you're dealing with, to get your garbage bins handled, visit localwaste.ca, reach out to their team. They love to help you get out of bad contracts and design something that works better for your small business. The relationship with Local Waste will grow as your business grows. And on the flip side, if your community, if you're an entrepreneur and you see an opening for Local Waste in your community, they're always looking. I mean, they've just added some new partners in Saskatchewan over the past number of months. You can check out their social media for details on that. They're always looking for partnerships on both sides of the coin at localwaste.ca. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome our next guest to the program. It's sometimes a rarity. It's a cliche, to be sure, unless it fits. But it's oftentimes a rarity where you could look across an entire country and say, this guy literally needs no introduction. As soon as I start to describe him as the man in motion, you know exactly who I'm talking about, don't you? He's a 6-time Paralympic medalist. He undertook an epic 26-month, 40,000-kilometer journey around the world in his wheelchair. He's the founder of an organization committed to creating a world without barriers for people with disabilities. Of course, I'm talking about Rick Hansen, making his Real Talk debut. What a thrill to have you here, my friend. Thanks so much for making time for us today.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate it. What an honor. Thanks for having me in.
Well, I can tell you. Can I tell you something personal? There's a family connection here. My brother Kyle, who's a theater actor out of Vancouver, was so blessed and so lucky to play you in the theatrical production of Rick, of course, which toured right around the time of the 2010 Vancouver Olympics. And so we as a family have long admired your accomplishments, and it really means a lot to have you here on the show.
Oh, well, thanks, Ryan. And hey, listen, say a big hi to Kyle for me. He's an amazing young man, and it was fantastic to have him play, my role, but more importantly, that the whole Manitoba Youth Theatre brought that story to the next generation and right across the country. We were really honored. Yeah, no kidding. Well, Rick, we've been talking about Disability Pride Month this month. We've had so many different angles and opportunities to address some of the barriers that folks face, and as well as some of the many wins that people are experiencing. We've met so many inspiring people. When it comes to, let's say the timing of this, and I want to talk about your partnership with Athabasca University and their Power Ed program in just a moment. But how does a guy like you, a high profile, a celebrity essentially, and one that has inspired millions of people, what does a month like Disability Pride Month mean to you? Well, first of all, it's a chance for people to be able to remind ourselves just how big a deal disability is. People often underestimate the prevalence of disability in our society. Globally, there's 1.3 billion people living with a disability, according to the WHO. Aging baby boomers makes that exponentially growing in the future. In Alberta, it's 22%, that are 15 years of age and older. And we often sort of don't recognize how big it is because it's so fragmented. And so we want to bring people together on the big issues. Like it's important. It's a big demographic. It has huge social justice related issues, but also economic and cultural issues that we need to address in order to keep celebrating our successes, but also, moving the bar higher and higher every year on the long, ultra marathon of social change.
The ultra marathon of social change. I love that. Can we revisit the very beginning? I mean, can we take a look at the Man in Motion tour and ultimately, I mean, we're going to see some iconic images here of you on the Great Wall of China, the Tower Bridge in London, and just absolutely unbelievable stuff. What did you at the outset of that journey? What were you hoping to accomplish right at the beginning?
You know, as a young kid in my mid-20s, I had this dream that maybe I could actually use my marathon talents as a Paralympian and wheel around the world to create awareness of the potential of people with disabilities, and also to challenge people to remove barriers that happen to still be there, whether they be physical or attitudinal or social, and really to listen to local champions in the community, because they could point the way if all we could do is come together as a movement. But little did I know how big the country was and the world, and ultimately how inaccessible it was and disconnected. And so, it was a baby step forward on this long journey. And I was just so honored and proud to have so many amazing people support this young dream. And it moved from an endeavor over 2 years, 2 months and 2 days to become a lifelong mission.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, and your life's work has been absolutely remarkable. How would you characterize when we come to issues around accessibility and issues ultimately around equity and equality? How different is the landscape now from that Man in Motion tour? I mean, how far have we come?
Well, you think about it, back then, we had just landed a constitution and a charter of rights and freedom that actually for one of the most progressive constitutions in the entire planet, where people with disabilities were, recognized as equals, and that they shouldn't be impeded by any unnatural barrier. And so, yet those lofty words were embedded. There's still massive barriers in Canada and around the world. And so, human rights have been continually to be reinforced. Whether it be in China, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act in the States, things through the European Union, and those levels of progression create tremendous hope that that this is a global cultural value. And now in Canada, we're still to this day having our federal government just 2 years ago implemented a Canadians with Disabilities Act, and we have only 4 provinces in the country that have then embedded provincial legislation to create a social safety net. Municipalities and Indigenous communities are still grappling with this issue. And so we've come a long way, lots to celebrate, but boy, it's still hard to believe that we have so far to go.
And what do you think it is, Rick? I mean, with regards to why some of these barriers still exist, it's not as though people aren't aware of them. What are some of the biggest challenges to actually impacting meaningful change?
I think, first of all, everybody tends to associate, disability with perhaps a body part or some clinical diagnosis, either, what's the symbol of disability that we see in today's society everywhere? It's the iconic stick man in a wheelchair, but, what about someone who has, a visual challenge, whether they're blind or, they have low vision, or hearing challenge, whether they're deaf or hard of hearing. What about someone who has an invisible disability that's not so easily identifiable? And so what about people who have temporary disabilities, or those who are in the family or connected? Over 50% of people have had some either temporary or permanent disability, or live with someone who does. And so it's how do you figure out how to make that a big deal so that people recognize that this isn't a marginalized issue. Secondly, I think the other side is that there's always that, we're coming in a very short period of time in our history from an old model where people with disabilities, if you had one, you and your family were kind of in trouble and to be pitied, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity. And in today's world, the expectation is that, that you truly can fully participate in society. There's all kinds of amazing possibilities if barriers are removed. And so that psychology is shifting, and expectations are changing rapidly. And then also it's one of those realities where we think about the problems that you think that it's a huge issue related to cost. Costs are big barriers. So, it's too expensive to make all these places accessible or include people with disabilities. But people don't actually look at the costs of confinement, about the existing constraining or restricting policies. Massive unemployment, lack of opportunities to be a consumer or fully contribute, volunteer, or work in the workplace, all these restrictive, difficult realities to get disability supports just to survive. And so those levels of awareness still aren't coming up to levels of government where the leadership truly gets it. And our community is still a little too fragmented to be able to come together. There's still a lot of cross levels of interest. And so our goal is to get a lot of these big barriers where most people can actually, identify with the solution and come in without giving up the other micro concerns that they might have, which are many and valid.
It's so I'm not necessarily comparing these two scenarios, although there probably are comparisons that could exist, but it's the same sort of a thing when you talk about affordable childcare or you talk about some sort of subsidized childcare, and people will say, well, what's it going to cost and how are you going to pay for it? And people will say also, what's the cost of not having it, right? Look at how it keeps people out of the workforce. Look at how it stops economic stimulus. And I would imagine you could make the identical argument here. I mean, in a way you just did.
Well, for sure. There's about 500,000 people in the workforce ready, willing, and able to be able to come in and participate and engage. Just imagine the turnaround opportunities that has. Consumers who are willing to engage and participate as well fully if you're open for business, or if you're thinking about product innovation to meet their needs and ensure that they can fully engage in society. Global market opportunities in multi-billion-dollar industries. Global tourism as COVID re-enters. And then, of course, about $17 billion to the local, tax realities, either municipal, provincial, or federal, if people are really engaged. And, so those are massive returns, if you start thinking about those.
What's the 17 billion, Rick?
Yeah, it's a $17 billion, according to, the Conference Board of Canada. If people with disabilities by 2030 were able to be engaged, in the economy and, in the workforce, that's the turnaround, it happens because why? Well, people are able to move forward and be engaged in our society. And so I think the reality is here, Ryan, is moving people from the old kind of just the charitable model, which is, way back pre-my tour, and even beyond the human rights model, which is so critical in today's world, but also thinking of the economic and cultural value proposition, that actually comes forward. Because if we do the right thing, it's not just the right thing, it's also massively beneficial for our economy, for our culture and our society. Some of the greatest innovations, that you can deliver for making the world better and more accessible for people with disabilities, it's good for everybody. And so why not?
Yeah. You know what? I've often said, it's kind of unfortunate sometimes that you have to make an economic argument for something that may be described as a social investment to get people on board. But there's absolutely also nothing wrong with pointing out that there are huge economic benefits to lifting people up and to encourage, to providing those platforms, those incentives of that funding.
Well, exactly. And also you have to think about this too, is that expectations back in the 70s and 80s have shifted dramatically for people with disabilities and their view of what's possible and what they think is an appropriate human right. And when we put standards in place, which bedrock those expectations of the time, 10 years, a decade, 2 decades go by, and guess what happens? People's expectations shift, and also so does technology, innovation, product development, new systems and opportunities. And so today's standards can become tomorrow's handicaps. And so the innovation side, when you actually keep people thinking about the outcome, their creativity and energy, doesn't get stymied by some old standard or benchmark. The goal is to get to and beyond that line and keep going, because that's what humans do, if you let them, and if you create the framework for that innovation to thrive.
Rick, how would you, we've got audience members here, like Carrie is really engaged right now on our live chat, watching on YouTube, and says, wants me to ask you about the Canada Disability Benefit and the Accessible Canada Act. We did hear from one of our expert guests last week that said that the Canada Disability Benefit really excludes a lot of persons with disabilities. How would you, I'm asking you sort of a massive question here, so approach it as you see fit, but how would you characterize how different levels of government, and maybe in particular the federal government, is doing on this file right now?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the reality is that Canada, we have to recognize, we're a confederation, and this multi-levels of jurisdictional responsibility it's a huge handicap if we're not working together to build bridges and harmonize and to try to get it right. Because the federal government will do their part, but it still requires the provinces and municipalities and Indigenous communities to be able to do their part. And if we're all doing it our own way because we have jurisdictional responsibility and authority, without thinking about harmonizing and really bringing the principle to life, then somebody might do something at some level and they're missing it at the provincial level. It doesn't translate. And in the area of disability, that's not acceptable. And Canada needs more bridges to inclusivity and harmonization than we do barriers. And barriers to jurisdiction are part of the responsibility of politicians and leaders to be able to get past, build the country together, and figure out what we actually have in common and make those things happen. Disability is one of the great unifiers when you start thinking of those solutions. And so that federal piece on disability supports, income equality, we have to keep elevating it and not accept the intrinsic barriers that might be in place in a current proposal. And that's up to the disabled community to come together and keep pushing hard. So I think we have to make sure that at the baseline, people with disabilities have that basic level of income support because they're hugely unemployed or marginalized, and that their disability supports come with them as they move forward. And just because you get married, it doesn't mean that you should lose your basic supports to be able to function in a community, especially given the intrinsic barriers that are currently out there. Or if you get a job, heaven forbid, don't you want to be high performing? And you're going to more than turn that around, as you drive into, the tax position, or as you drive into the contribution as a philanthropist or a community contributor.
Yeah, we talked to a couple of guests late last week, including Reverend James Rock out of Toronto. And he wrote a piece, I think it was in the Star or the Globe. I can't remember who published it, but he wrote a piece on this, how he said marriage equality continues to be denied. Marriage equality does not exist for people with disabilities in Canada. He talked about that. I had no idea, Rick. I had no idea that if people with disabilities were to enjoy the emotional connection and love and real life and what we would assume to be a basic human right to cohabit with someone and to build a life together, that they lose their benefits. That was one example that I think blew a lot of people's minds.
Well, that's the reality, is most people don't realize until it happens to them, or they have a family member and then they realize, oh my gosh, I had no idea of these big barriers that still exist. And there are thousands of them. And, we could spend forever, dissecting and getting into every single one. But, from my perspective, I'm trying to, get people to come together, elevate on some of the big ones that converge, and definitely ones that we can actually influence going forward together.
Rick, do you have a personal opinion on what income support should look like? I understand that we can talk about federal incentives and provincial incentives. I'm most familiar, although I'll acknowledge I'm probably not familiar enough with the assured income for the severely handicapped in Alberta for AISH, but I also, of course, know that there are federal supports available. There's been a lot of talk, I think probably more than ever before, as a result of the pandemic, about things like a universal basic income, a UBI, which I know a lot of people would like to see as a significant part of a political platform next time there is a federal election. Do you have a personal opinion on what appropriate income supports look like?
Yeah, I think that's reality. There should be a universal disability income, and it should be identified at a reasonable level that makes sense for people and the conditions and situations that they're living in, and that shouldn't be negotiable, as well as the disability support side. Also, think about the hoops that people have to go through. The system is often built on the expectation that somehow someone is going to, build the system. like 99.9% of the population, they're just like totally focused on just surviving and getting out there and doing the best they can. And they're totally honorable. And so why don't we get the red tape out of the way and give people a sense of trust and responsibility, and ultimately, there's some innovations in place that really force us to think globally. Australia has, a disability, supports program where they've actually targeted the supports to people with disabilities and their family, quote, caregiver or designate, and they get a chance to navigate through the system to purchase and acquire the supports that they need. And what does that do? That creates a much more responsive consumer, client customer responsibility. If you're getting the right services, you're gonna fund it, or if you're getting the right products in the right way with the right provider, you're gonna acquire that support. And so I think there's some really interesting things to think about for Canada as we go forward. We don't need to sort of put our head down. We can look globally for some successes and inspiration, and then craft our own next generation levels of support. But also think about it. If you're a youth, in most of Canadian structure, from a provincial point of view, you get a fair bit of support, a fair bit, along the way. And then you reach a certain age where you're no longer classified as a youth, and you're in significant trouble. I get calls from all over the country, families desperate for, how do I my child, who has serious and severe cerebral palsy, and they need transportation, and we've had our income support to be able to fund an accessible van. That van has been operating for over 20 years, and it's now on its last legs. They've just crossed the boundary between being a youth and now an adult, and their funding is gone, and we can't find anywhere to find those levels of support. How does that work? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. Well, why is that? Well, it's because, people are fragmented into these silos, and they're not thinking about the whole human being on their journey, from youth, into aging, and aging with dignity.
Yeah. Dignity is such a huge part of that. Rick, we're really proud here on Real Talk to partner with Athabasca University, and I know you are too with their Power Ed program. Can you tell us a little bit? People can check out more at powered.ca, but the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program. Can you take us into this and describe how buildings would get awarded the RHF, the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certified Gold? How do they achieve this?
Yeah, Ryan, one of the big barriers out there, aside from awareness about disability being a big deal, is the built environment. Humans build the built environment for humans and the places we work, live, learn, and play. And so those places, when they're being built, should be built, with the principles of universal and inclusive design, the most benefit for the most people, so a building can be fully used and functional. And unfortunately, with the area of disability and accessibility and inclusion, that's not the norm. What we have is incredible fragmentation, again, as mentioned, federally, provincially, municipally, and Indigenous in communities. And so we find that there's different interpretations of that, different standards, different building codes, and all the power and knowledge is largely held with a small group of people in the disability community who are the advocates, who have been pushing so hard for this to become normal. And it's also then held in some very small, quote, pseudo-expert design people. And it's like putting your mouth to a fire hose. They're pushing so hard, trying to grab it all, and it keeps coming at them. Why? Because the design community, the professionals, from the point where they're actually educated at a university, if you're an architect, you're an engineer, you're a city planner, or whatever you're in, there is no requirement, fundamental requirement, to actually have this knowledge and get it right every time. And then also to be innovative beyond what means right. And so we decided to take a page out of the energy efficient building community, which is ironic. Energy is kind of an important afterthought to be able to ensure buildings are efficient, but gosh, we're still trying to get people into this equation. And we decided to make sure that, well, let's take that knowledge upstream. Let's educate, in a continuing education program, all the professionals who are out there in the design and the built community, and now they can get accredited and get a designation, and so now they're fully, capable of being able to produce a building and make sure that there are no unintended barriers, and they're not just lowballing it to an old code.
Yeah.
And the building comes out not just basically accessible, but somewhere beyond, called accessibility certified gold, every new building. And, so we need to have education partners. We built a world-class standard, which is the curriculum base for this knowledge. inputted by all these, advocates and specialists. And they now have a training program that's in over 7 different universities and colleges across the country. And Athabasca is the, online global delivery of this digital program now. And they're training hundreds and hundreds of professionals. And the goal is if we get them upstream, then all we have to focus on is provincial governments, federal governments, and institutions, and private sector, and say, you just make sure that there's a policy that everybody who's bidding for your proposal, has to have a designated person that's accredited and a provisional rating before the concrete gets poured, because erasers, to pencil on paper are easy to change. And then when it's finished, it's rated officially at an independent level with our partners at the Canadian Standards Association. And they say, this is designated gold. Now let's celebrate the heck out of that. And then government can come in behind and start to maybe go after the compliance side against human rights. But meanwhile, we've got more people to and beyond the line faster. And it helps to unify the whole country, even though governments take time to come in behind and harmonize. So we're pointing the way, not waiting, but yet we're inspiring and saying, hey, come on, guys, let's all get on the same program and let's get there faster.
Yeah, so this is, in a way, because, ultimately what you want to do, I'm not saying you, Rick Hansen, let me say what we collectively would want to do is say buildings, code must include this. It must reflect this. It must not be an option. This, of course, I think the program's amazing and the affiliation, the partnership's excellent. It does require some sort of a personal or corporate initiative, right? And I know you'd probably love to take it so much further.
Yeah, well, for sure. And the way that works is, government, of Alberta, you're spending $3 billion, in infrastructure, over the next couple of years, and even more is going to come in as time moves on, as we come back out of COVID. The clock's ticking. Every time you make a procurement decision and they don't have a qualified, accredited person on their team, you're getting a building that's coming out probably driven to an old code, and probably with barriers. Now that's a tax on your dollars, an ineffective tax, because what's happening is it's a reaction then from the disabled community about disappointment and a lowball outcome. Now there's energy, there's cost, there's redesign, then there's redevelopment, which is another cost. And then all that time of yet not having that building be fully functional, where the economic and cultural payoffs happen. So why would we do that if we were really thinking about an efficient economic and cultural and social Canada? Let's get urgent about it.
I agree. And this is about more than just, can you shatter our general understanding of what we're talking about here, Rick? Like this is about more than just wheelchair ramps, right? Like this is a way bigger conversation.
Yeah, that's what I said, is that we have an old expectation that accessibility means stick man and wheelchair. Let's maybe even change that accessibility symbol. We're talking people with visual, hearing, mobility, those that are not so visible, cognitive challenges on wayfinding, emergency outcomes. Let's use the building, and someone can actually not just be at the front counter being a participant. You can be behind the counter being fully employed.
Yeah.
Where's that thinking?
Yeah, no kidding. So there's this, I think, initiative that people can check out. They can check out powered.ca and, of course, seek to learn more here. Do you, when it comes to the role that you have, I think when people mention you, it's amazing what happens. We were having almost an incredibly divisive conversation on the show right before you came on, and then you come on, and everyone, and I don't care what people's politics are or anything else, everybody goes, Rick, like first name basis. Everybody you meet must refer to you by a first name basis. I can't imagine what that must be like for you, good and bad. But at the same time, do you see this being enough of a part of the national conversation, or do you kind of lament it some days? Do you kind of wonder what's it going to take for people to care about this?
Yeah, it's always the dynamic tension between being, grateful and celebrating success, recognizing how big the issue is and how long the journey is.
Yeah.
And with the, the real clear understanding that and the urgency that we're not nearly there. We still have a long way to go. And so celebrating the successes, the champions, whether they're in the community that represents people with disabilities, whether it's those that are engaged, showing the way and modeling the way, or, any institution, government that's actually doing their best now, but not being satisfied. That doesn't mean we're there. And keep pushing for solutions. Problems are easy to find and identify. Solutions are where the action is, and that's where, for 35 years, plus, I've been engaged in. And it's sometimes frustrating. There's no question, but you gotta own where your attitude and where your focus is, because life is precious. We only have a little bit of energy. Let's bring it forward to make a difference the best you can, and know that if you really want to have things happen, though, it can never be one man in motion. It's all of us, and the more people we can get engaged, trying to create a movement that's not just national, but global. I didn't just wheel across the country, and my inspiration didn't come just from Canada. It came from the world, was reflected towards the world, and the world is smaller and more connected today than it's ever been. And so why can't and why shouldn't Canada be engaged in something that is globally relevant and significant, show the way how we respond, but participate in support and engage and learn from a global society? And if we can do that with the issue of disability, where it's the world's largest minority, it's one where anyone, anytime can and will eventually join in your lifetime. Unfortunately, The reality is this is the one thing that can bring us together. So let's start doing it. Let's start acting that way.
Amazing perspective. Rick, so you and your team at the Rick Hansen Foundation, I know, have worked with Athabasca University with the Power Ed program for more than 2.5 years to create the online version of this course, the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Training, an introductory course, Accessible Spaces 101, which can allow for those without the prerequisites required for the RHFAC, but nonetheless want to increase understanding of accessibility. You can find all the details at powered.ca. This might be a weird pivot, but I just have to say, we've been seeing these photos of you up there, and you are absolutely jacked in these photos, unbelievable. And of course, as we introduced you, I mean, a legendary Paralympian. I would imagine that with the Paralympics fast approaching out of Tokyo, they'll kick off on August 24th. This must be something that does it pique your interest each and every time? Where's your head at as we prepare to celebrate the Olympics and the Paralympics?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's going to be a strange one for sure. Yeah. But at the same time, the athletes have been training, most of them for their whole lives, and dreams are coming true and unfolding. And, I think it's great they get a chance to express themselves. And, the Paralympics are there now as part of the host country. And, that never existed back in the early 80s, so, getting closer and closer to seeing the athletes being recognized as athletes, which is an important reality. Yeah. Sport is a mirror for how society views itself. And when we see athletes with disabilities as special and sort of different, then sport has a negative impact on our values. So these Paralympians are bringing it together and showing ability and what's possible. And they are athletes, and that's all they want, and yet it's still driving more social change. Terry Fox and I, we played on the same wheelchair basketball together. We had great rivalries in Edmonton, with the Northern Lights, and yet, we were brought together. Paralympic sport actually helped shape our values, our sense of social responsibility, because we benefited from so many people who were volunteering and engaged in supporting us as athletes. We wanted to pay it forward in our own way, and so just think of all the people who come together from the Paralympic sport community that are not only expressing themselves as athletes, but they're actually people who have disabilities who are demonstrating ability. And through that process, they're helping push away the barriers for everybody in some way.
Absolutely thrilled to have a chance to welcome you to the show, Rick. Your message, I know, will resonate with thousands of people, and I'm so appreciative of your time and really excited to see the uptake on this partnership with Athabasca University. Again, Accessible Spaces 101, and of course, the establishment of the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Training. You can learn more at powered.ca, and you can also check out rickhansen.com. Thank you so much for blessing us all by spending some time with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan. Keep up the great work and say hi to Kyle for me, okay?
I sure will, Rick. Thanks very much. I know he's watching
best.
this. Yeah, you bet. That's did you love hearing a story like that? He's like, oh yeah, Terry Fox and I, we were playing wheelchair basketball. I'm sitting there going like, Terry Fox and Rick Hansen in the same room?
Yeah, Canada's two biggest, like most famous disability advocates, and they just play pickup basketball.
And probably, I mean, arguably, this is a bit of a strange exercise, but if you started to talk about who people would perceive, I know the CBC undertook this exercise many years ago of the greatest Canadian,
yes.
right? And people and Terry Fox, and people talk about Tommy Douglas, and I think Don Cherry was ultimately up on that list. Bit of a different avenue there, but really, I mean, Rick Hansen and Terry Fox, and what the two of them accomplished, and Terry Fox with such a tragically short window, unbelievable. And yet Rick Hansen continues to not just persevere. That's not what you would describe it. I mean, the guy just leads and drives people, driving the discussion, driving the initiatives and the programs. And I'd love to hear from you in so many ways as perhaps our trash talk presented by Local Waste on Friday may be fueled by our conversation on flat income tax. I wonder if Positive Reflections coming up on Monday may include some content based on some of your responses to hearing Rick Hansen on the show. I wouldn't be surprised. Positive Reflections is how we get our week started off on the right foot each and every Monday, or at least the first show of every week. And you can send in your positive reflections, a story that resonated with you, is someone that paid it forward, a random act of kindness. You can send those stories in to talk@ryanjesperson.com. Kubi Energy, of course, presenting Positive Reflections. The team at Kubi, well, right now, their team is at it. They've got a whole bunch of programs and right now incentives. They're digging in to help you understand how the cost of going net zero, right? How installing solar into your home, your business, maybe your commercial operation can make more sense now than ever because of all of these available rebates. The team keeps an eye on that stuff so you don't have to do all the digging online. You give them a call, you visit them at kubienergy.ca, and they're going to say, hey, listen, right now in Alberta, for example, did you know there's a brand new solar incentive, a rebate exclusively for agricultural producers? It's true. I only know that because Jake at Kubi Energy told me so. So you can find them online. And let me remind you that right now we are so proud to partner with the team at Kubi Energy to present the Real Talk Net Zero Solar Contest presented by the team at Kubi. If you're looking for the details on it, check out kubienergy.ca/realtalk. You have until the 25th of July. You have until the end of the weekend, but why wait that long? Why push it to the end? Why run it right up to the deadline to tell us your solar story? Why do you or somebody you know most deserve the chance to go net zero for free? For free. No strings attached. We're starting to get powerful letters about people that would love to see nonprofits benefit. We've heard some tragic stories, some inspiring ones. People are painting wonderful pictures with regards to why they deserve to win the Real Talk Net Zero Solar Contest presented in whole by Kubi Energy. We're putting the approximate value of this prize at $15,000. Might be a little bit less, might be a little bit more, depending on what your custom solar install looks like. But the point is, you will incur exactly zero cost. Somebody's going to get a free net zero solar system. All the details at kubienergy.ca/realtalk. You submit your solar story to our email inbox, talk@ryanjesperson.com. And next week, Real Talkers, will be putting this to you. We want you to choose our winner. We're going to do it by way of a vote. And next Monday, we'll explain all the details. Also wanted to remind you that this studio is powered by the team at Westworld Computers. And if you check them out online, you're going to see all the lineup available for your browsing, including these brand new iMacs. I know that everybody's excited about these. I don't know if Sam takes a look at these. Do you take a look at these and do you get iMac envy? They've got all the colors
just a
now.
Little bit. It's like the evolution of the iMac has gone from colors to silver to colors again.
Yeah.
And now we're back to, and they were white for a while.
If you were
and
to
I'm just
pick
like,
a color,
these ones look sharp.
If you were to replace your current studio horsepower with a new iMac, what color do you think you might choose?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I feel like because this is the Real Talk studio, we're probably gonna have to go blue. Blue or green.
Well,
right?
you're color coordinating.
Exactly.
Although Carrie, my wife, she's a lifestylist. She always tells me where I fall short on fashion. She says, "Ryan, you're too matchy. You can't be too matchy all the time."
I'm just trying to be on brand.
The point is,
personally, I like the orange.
You can peruse. Yeah, I had an orange one in university, the old school one, the original, the OG. Daryl and his team have been going back 40 years on this, independently and family-owned, including their service techs. You can book your appointment now or shop. They'll ship across the country at westworld.ca. There's a new book out, and this is powerful stuff. I mean, this really, for a lot of you, is probably not something that's been on your radar, but a fellow by the name of James Ballard has just written a book called Poisoned Jungle. Now, here's what's super cool about this. James is a first-time author at 71 years of age with this autobiography. The novel details his time as a medic in Vietnam, all the way through to his time as a beekeeper in the Peace Country in northern Alberta. Yeah, that's right. Somewhat of an unlikely journey, so to speak, but it explores the ideas around PTSD, what we've learned as a society, and even touches on the long-term impacts of the Vietnamese, including Agent Orange. The Poison Jungle was published in fall of 2020, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome James Ballard to the program. Welcome to Real Talk, and thanks for making time for us, James.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. It's quite a thrill to be on with Rick Hansen.
Yeah, well, hey, here you are following Rick Hansen, and let me say, I won't compare the stories, but your story, remarkable in its own right. 71 years of age, you released your first novel based, I suppose, on your own retrospective. What prompted you to put pen to paper and to get this thing published?
Well, a couple of things. I started writing, realizing that with my sons, I never knew if I'd told them too much or too little about my experiences in the war, and I wanted to have an account of the war in my own words. And since I've always been a reader, I've read a lot of literature throughout my life. It just seemed a natural to put it into a novel, even though it is a semi-autobiographical novel. And one thing kind of led to another as I'd tried to write over the years, but I was busy with career and family. And so as writers say, I never really found my voice until a little bit before my 65th birthday, when I started, it just flowed out. It didn't mean it was any good at that point, but at least I had found my voice. So that's the beginning of it.
Well, can I say that it might be a bit of an understatement that you found your voice, because your book has already won an Independent Book Publishers Association award for Best New Voice. So obviously your story has resonated with a whole bunch of people, including the critics, which says something. Why don't we rewind to where this whole story gets started? I mean, your upbringing and yourself as a young man. How did you wind up in Vietnam?
Well, there was my timing has never been particularly good, I think. I graduated from high school in 1967 in the U.S., and combat troops were dispatched to Vietnam in 65. The American presence in Vietnam predated that, but only in an advisory capacity. The war really heated up for the Americans in 65. So graduating from high school in 67, I didn't have a student deferment, and I got swept up into the American war effort. And by December of 1968, I was in the war zone as a medic.
Did you, were you drafted?
Initially, and I gave the Army an extra year in order to be a medic. I wanted to train as a medic.
Okay.
So,
And is that because, was there any particular reasoning behind that?
I think I had some kind of inner wish not to kill, I guess, or that's not expressing it very, very well. But
I think it's cutting to the chase.
I wanted to. I didn't want to participate in that aspect of the war. Now, that didn't keep me out of the field. That didn't keep me out of combat. But to this day, I don't regret my decision to be a medic.
What do you, when it comes to your time there, and let me acknowledge that it's typically as an interviewer. I mean, I've had conversations with many people that have served, in particular with the Canadian Forces, and if I can just have some real talk with you right now, I mean, there's I think a responsibility on behalf of an interviewer to show great respect and certain sensitivities with regards to the questions we ask, and asking people that have been diagnosed in particular with PTSD to revisit the experience or to revisit the trauma. Before I ask you questions about it, and before we continue to get into your book, do you find it difficult to talk about? Does it trigger certain memories, or does it take you back to a place that's difficult to revisit, to talk about it like this in an interview?
Not at this point in life. I think the broader perspective is war trauma is a type of trauma, but there's many types of emotional trauma. And I think that what I tried to do with the book was broaden the scope of the awareness of how trauma impacts people. And so I've 50 years out of my war, and I'm not saying that I don't have painful memories, but the triggers, I think I've learned how to, to deal with the triggers. And there's something positive in trying to address the issues of war trauma in a broader perspective.
James, you live with PTSD and survivor's guilt. How long did it take, or at what point in your life did you recognize that? Were you diagnosed with that, or did you have the words to describe what you knew you were experiencing?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. Denial is a very powerful human coping mechanism. And coming out of the war, at the time, there was no such thing as PTSD. Of course, it was called other things in previous wars, shell shock in World War I and battle fatigue in World War II. But I think part of the added trauma for the Vietnam veteran was the poor reception at home. Like, I landed at Travis Air Force Base in late October of 1969, and there was a raging anti-war demonstration going on. And the horrible irony for many of us was simply that we were very, I came back from the war very much against the war, very disheartened by my country's participation in the war. So it just is, it was an added dimension that I think created more difficulty for the Vietnam vets to heal.
A huge amount. I mean, I can't act like I've walked an inch in your boots. But if you compare the reception to servicemen and women returning from Vietnam to those that returned from World War II, or that returned from tours in many circumstances in the Middle East, just dramatically different.
Yes, and I think there's kind of a triad of the psychological consequences of war. There's, of course, the PTSD, which is much more known, then the survivor's guilt, which as a medic, I had tremendous survivor's guilt. And then there's something else that psychologists are delineating, and that's moral injury. And it has to do with the psychic wreckage from war trauma. And it was like it was like a light bulb going on when I first came across some of the writings on moral injury. And to answer your question, I probably started realizing the most in my 40s. It took until then to really, a lot started to be dredged up from my subconscious. I'm not entirely sure what triggered it, but it sent me searching and able to deal with it more directly and talk with other veterans about it. And it was to be recognized, to be recognized by myself. It really was a big step in being able to have some concrete healing. And I think the beekeeping for me was tremendously healing. So I had some healing going on just by my career choice. In the Peace Country, a fabulous area. I was fortunate enough to make a living from beekeeping, and that experience was very healing in and of itself without the conscious awareness of the PTSD.
Well, this is part of the reason why I found your story to be so compelling, and why we insisted that you join us here on the show. It's your story in one sentence, obviously not including so many relevant background details, is from Vietnam War medic to Northern Alberta beekeeper. And you go, wow, what a fascinating journey. So how do you wind up keeping bees in Northern Alberta, and how does this impact your perspective in the context of service in Vietnam?
Well, it's there's an interesting aspect, a little known aspect of PTSD, and some that's sometimes expressed as a hermetic urge, which so I had actually titled part 3 of the novel Hiding Out, which I was essentially, part of me was doing that in the Peace Country. I'd like to think I did that in a constructive way by raising my family and keeping bees for a living. But part of my psyche and my path had to do with this hermetic urge, I think, that often accompanies PTSD, and also this moral injury, which psychologists are talking more about now. But I think the first time I saw the inside of a beehive, it was just magical for me. And nature itself, the Peace Country is such a newly opened area for agriculture, and I just found that aspect of it just exhilarating. And the opening a beehive is a magical experience, or was for me.
Can I tell you, this happened, James, literally just yesterday. I was talking to somebody on the sidewalk, and a bee came around, a pretty good sized one, and she swatted at it and then immediately apologized and said, "Oh, I thought it was a wasp." And there was like this thing about the beautiful bee, right? She thought it was a wasp, and so she wanted to annihilate it. And she found it was a bee and was immediately apologetic. What is it about the bee? I mean, can you take us in, for those of us that have never donned the suit and opened up a hive? Wherein does the magic lie?
Well, I think it's an opportunity. It's a rare glimpse in the inner workings of nature. There's very few things where we can go into and observe the inner workings unfolding. Like when our beehives are designed to be able to go into the hive, check on the queen, on the brood nest, the stores of the hive, and do it without, a skilled beekeeper can do it without disrupting the hive. And there's also something just very magical about seeing the boxes fill up with honey and bringing in the pollen, which the bees need for their brood rearing. It's their source of protein. And just standing beside a hive and watching the bees come and go is just fascinating. And I think for a beekeeper, so many beekeepers have that, have that fascination.
I bet. Do you, I mean, when you look back on it, do you think that your experience keeping bees, interacting with these magnificent creatures, I mean, did that contribute in a way to you achieving manageable levels of mental health and ultimately working toward your recovery? I mean, would you credit some of that to nature, so to speak?
Yes. Oh, definitely. I think nature itself is, to me, is very healing. And to be, I felt very privileged to be able to make a living so close to the natural world. We would have, at our peak, we had maybe 50 to 60 different bee yards in different locations, some of them as far as maybe 40 miles away from our farm. And some of the farms are literally right on the edge of the wilderness. And it was I never got tired of driving through the countryside to my bee yards, checking to see which locations were doing well and scouting new locations. And it was just, it was very healing. Yes.
Before I wrap here, I want to sort of get back to the premise of the book, which is ultimately the impact of war and the effects it has on people and on nations. And you write about Agent Orange exposure, and in particular, that for so many, the war never ends. Can you take us into this idea and ultimately what you'd like people to be aware of on that front?
Yes. I think for many, because of the trauma, the war never ends for some. I think part 2 of the novel is titled War Without End. And so that was mostly dealing with the psychological repercussions, but also the some of the serious injuries which cause lifelong disabilities, as well as lifelong pain. And when I had a few months left in the Army once I returned from Vietnam, and I was assigned to the quadriplegic ward at the Presidio of San Francisco. And it was, it's hard to describe the psychic devastation as well as the physical devastation for these young men whose, lives were, disrupted. And I mean, it's so fascinating to me to listen to Rick Hansen today, who's, paralyzed, but it's a remarkable journey of his to cope and thrive the way he's done after his injury. But so many of the young men back from the war who were paralyzed from the neck down, it was just extremely difficult, and the depression and the severity of the injuries, along with the pain, it truly hit home how the war doesn't end for a lot of us.
Well, it's an absolutely powerful book. James has mentioned already, an award winner. If people want to learn more about it or order a copy right now of James Ballard's Poisoned Jungle, you can learn more at james-ballard.com. It's available anywhere great books are sold. And my understanding is that you're already working on another?
Yes, I've got a second novel, a submittable draft now. It's taken me about 5 drafts to get it to a submittable point. But it's part of a trilogy that if I don't run out of years, I will try and complete a trilogy. So
absolutely amazing stuff, James. Well, congratulations on the book. What an absolutely powerful story. Thank you for being willing to share it with us, and we appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan.
Yeah,
my pleasure.
Thank you. That's author James Ballard. Again, james-ballard.net. Let me read just a portion of this. So he writes, I mean, this is the guy's first novel, but he's writing about Agent Orange and, how the war never ends. Agent Orange exposure has had devastating effects for both American veterans and the people of Vietnam, where the contamination continues, being churned up in the soils and stream beds and toxic hotspots from leakage of the dioxins in the defoliants. Not only carcinogenic, the chemicals have caused embedded changes in the genes of subsequent generations. For so many, the war never ends. Then an excerpt from Poisoned Jungle. Powerful stuff. Really appreciate him talking to us about that. Before we wrap, I want to remind you that if your family's looking to get outdoors and you want to make sure that you are properly equipped, the team at Campers Village is ready to go right now. They've got 3 stores in Alberta, but of course they're always open online at campers-village.com. The website's super easy to navigate, and they'll ship anywhere in Canada. Most orders over $49 ship for free. It's picnic season, it's camping season, hiking season. So whether it's hammocks or dinnerware or navigation aids or sun and bug protection or energy bars or pillows or rooftop tents or, well, you get the point. You will find it all at Alberta's trusted source for backcountry, car camping, fishing, hiking, picnicking, and everything else. If you're going to be enjoying getting outside, make sure you have the equipment you need from our friends at Campers Village at campers-village.com. Also want to remind you, if you'd like to reimagine your outdoor space, you're working with a budget, you've got problems that you need solved, maybe it's drainage. I know I always talk about drainage. That's because in my hyper-awareness, that's the problem we need to solve with our landscaping. So I've talked to Mike from Eden Landscaping about it. He says to me, he goes, you can tell Real Talkers, we've been in the business of solving problems. And then he gets this gleam in his eye, and he says, you can even tell Real Talkers if other landscaping companies have not been able to solve their problems. Those are some of our favorite projects. They've been doing it for more than 20 years, bringing outdoor spaces to life, retaining walls, gazebos, outdoor kitchens, swim spas, planter boxes, you name it. They've done it, and they'd love to do it for you at landscapeedmonton.ca. That's where you'll find our friends at Eden Landscaping. And of course, what can we say other than we feed our own dogs Grand Dog Essentials quality raw food? You're hearing me talk about the raw beef and the raw chicken and everything else that our dogs, Moses and Monroe, have enjoyed. But what about alternative protein options? If you go to granddog.ca right now, you can see their Doggy Moggy sample pack. How about the raw pork? What about whole herring? What about bison? Tons of choices, and of course their nutritionists are ready to consult with you anytime they want to find a custom plan that makes sure that your dog, the beloved four-legged family members in your life, get the care and the food that they deserve. If you use the promo code REALTALK at granddog.ca, even before it winds up delivered right to your door in Edmonton, Calgary, or Central Alberta, you're going to save 10% off your first-time order, and then you can join their mailing list for exclusive discounts at granddog.ca. The rest of the week, we got a lot of ground to cover here on Real Talk, including tomorrow, curbing extremism. Where does that need to start? We'll talk to Dr. Ubaka Ogbogu about vaccine passports. And then how are 2 Real Talk sponsors, Bitcoin Well and Kubi Energy, working together towards sustainable crypto mining? Later in the week, we'll talk about tuberculosis. We'll learn about why chefs are boycotting salmon. And we'll talk about building more inclusive communities. Make it a great day.